Let's open with a word of prayer. Okay, so these study I'd like us to consider today. And of course, I guess the study is, one, discuss the importance of inclusive language. The context for this, I should say, was something that Elder Parminder said in one of his studies on the tail end of last year, which would be that it would be good if we looked at this more closely. So I think in response to that, no doubt, people will be looking at it to sort of understand what it is, its importance, its influence, what goes into it. But I thought to, I guess, at least among us as the Canadian group, to share a short study about it, and then hopefully we can better understand and become more settled, more confirmed in our understanding of its importance now, right? When it comes to character development personally, and how we relate to other people in a world where we believe in gender equality and are trying to promote that principle. So as always, your input is invited, your questions, your comments, whatever thoughts you have are invited at any point. So I will say that before Elder Parminder made that statement that it would be good for us to go and look at inclusive language and talk about it more. I was not aware, I had no knowledge in sort of any sort of scientific or evidentiary basis for the practice of adopting inclusive language. I understood it from a progressive lens as the respectful thing to do to make people feel included and seen. But what I've come to understand after looking into it is that there is quite a lot of research on it by linguists, by psychologists, and cognitive behavioralists to establish the fact that there is a scientific basis for the idea of inclusive language. And so we want to discuss that. So we'll begin by, again, excuse me, answering the question, what is inclusive language? Maybe this would be a good point if anyone is willing to share quickly in terms of what your thoughts are regarding what is inclusive language. How do you understand it in your own words? I have a definition here, which I got from an article published in the American Psychological Association, in the magazine of the American Psychological Association. But how do we understand it? When you hear inclusive language, does anyone have any thoughts that they're willing to venture to share quickly? Trevor,
Yes.
mic is open.
Just referring to people correctly, maybe just to get like a guess or whatever. Like you know what I mean? Like
I know what
not
you mean.
not just brushing over the whole crowd, but identifying people correctly.
Yeah. I know what you mean, but those who may be contrary to your perspective may say that, what is correct is relative. What is correct to me is not necessarily correct to you, but I get what you're saying. Murray,
I think it, oh, sorry.
Murray had opened his mic first, then we'll come to you.
I was sort of thinking it as more of a negative definition. It's language that doesn't make people feel excluded. That's
Mhm.
sort of, and it's more of a negative side of it, but it's language that doesn't make them feel excluded. So I don't know. So referring to people like guys, hey guys, that might be.
Yeah.
And we looked at that sort of as well, but just a thought.
That's getting to the crux of it. Sakai?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was gonna say, basically, I was gonna say it's not necessarily language that referring people to what they ask, or that's one part of it, but not using terms that make assumptions about gender.
Mhm.
So basically, speaking in a way that's more gender neutral in general, which
Mhm.
isn't making assumptions about gender with respect to anything. So if you and I are having a conversation about your visit to a doctor, I wouldn't automatically say refer to him as he.
Yes.
I would probably refer to him as they.
Okay.
And not always like giving someone a gender before you're clear on what their gender would be, or forcing a gender or forcing a gender or pronouns on someone before they have a chance to kind of identify as whatever, right? Because it's not just, sometimes when someone has a different gender identity or something like that, they might not have, if you just started calling them he or she, they'll just take it on the chin. But you don't actually provide a safe place for them to be able to say, oh yeah, you know what, I actually go by they, them, or I actually go by this pronoun or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
and trying to really slow yourself down on using gender, or just not using it at all. I feel like, and I'm just talking about inclusive language with respect to gender. I think it's broader than that in some respect.
And that is true. Sorry, I guess in plain language, that kind of gets to the crux of it. And so I think at least most of us, if the comments that have been made are reflective of the thinking of the group, most of us have at least a broad understanding of what it's about. But this definition here, it says inclusive language refers to language choices that aim to avoid biases, stereotypes, or assumptions about particular individuals or groups based on characteristics such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, or other factors. The goal of using inclusive language is to create communication that is respectful and considers the diverse identities and experiences of the audience. And then there's a second paragraph that says, inclusive language is more than just avoiding the use of a few antiquated or offensive terms and phrases. It is about embracing communication that acknowledges the power differentials and dynamics of our society and their deleterious or negative effects. It's about showing appreciation for the diversity everyone brings to the table. And it goes on. I think those are the portions that that I want to highlight. So yes, inclusive language, as stated by both Murray and Sakai, is language that is um, uh, seeks to avoid biases, stereotypes, and assumptions about groups of people over their mutable characteristics. But it brings in this important aspect of, excuse me, of power differentials. Now, when we bring it within the context of the Midnight Cry is a message identifying that between men and women at the beginning, a power differential was put in place as a result of sin. And that in the beginning in Eden, the power dynamic between men and women that prevailed after sin is not a reflection of God's perfect will, and that now, in this time, as we are returning to Eden, to the heavenly Eden, as we approach the end of the world, in the character development that has been taking place through the gospel, within the hearts and minds of God's children over the history of the church, that we're now at a time when addressing this issue of gender equality, right? Resolving that power differential between men and women that was brought about as a result of sin, that is present truth. So we are concerned with power differentials. We're concerned with power differentials as they appear across many subjects, race, but the testing issue right now is gender. And of course, it's not just men and women. We understand that gender is a spectrum. But right now, addressing the power differentials in the area of gender is present truth for us. So this is where inclusive language as something that is seen, something that has its purpose as addressing those power differentials, right, becomes something for us to look at, right? It becomes something for us to look at and seriously consider, given where we are and given what we believe, which is the midnight cry message. So I want to speak a bit more on why inclusive language is important. Again, there are a bunch of research papers that I'm taking this information from, and that I guess, presenting the points in them in narrative fashion. But why is language important, right? If we step away from inclusive language, why is language important? Why do we care? Of course, we've stated some of that already, but in this paper, it's an interesting paper called Contesting Representations of Migrant Illegality. Contesting representations of migrant illegality through the Drop the I Word campaign. So and it was published in a journal called Language and Social Justice in Practice. Okay, sorry, just give me a second. Okay. And it's discussing this this campaign, or rather, let me rather read the context. I'll just read what it has to say. So it makes the point that language can impact how we think about and approach problems. Language and reality are mutually enforcing. Our language reflects the world around us and influences how we think and what we do. And this is a key point, right? That is quite well understood by linguists and cognitive behaviorists, that language is not only reflective. Words not only reflect the world around us, putting names on things and concepts and dynamics that exist within our world. Language is not only reflective, it is creative. Language creates our reality. It influences how we think. It shapes the world around us. It shapes how we think, right? Language is both reflective and creative. So that becomes, and those concepts are mutually reinforcing, right? So if we use harmful language, right? So what is harmful language? And within the context of this document, it identifies, acknowledging an element of subjectivity, but it identifies that there are many types of harmful language, making harmful language difficult to define. But broadly speaking, harmful language is considered any language that results in harm, such as exploitation, mental, emotional, or physical distress, violation of privacy, damage to personal reputation, economic harm, decreased participation in civic or public life, as in silencing someone or a group of people, language that increases the tendency to hate, fear, discriminate against, or endorse violence against other people, including through dehumanization, or language that promotes falsehoods, right? So it says here that a caveat is included when you say language that when you say it says harmful language is any unnecessary language that results in harm, right? So that caveat is unnecessary, right? Harmful language is any unnecessary language that results in harm, and what follows are the other things that I've stated. But they say they include that caveat, right? That it's only unnecessary harm, because some language can cause mental or emotional distress, but nevertheless be necessary. Off the top of our heads, do you have any thoughts about that? Is there language that can cause mental or emotional distress, but that is necessary? Are you following me? Do you have any thoughts about that? We can think of any language that may cause mental, emotional distress, but that is in fact necessary. And an example is learning that systemic racism continues to impact members of minority groups, right? That can be distressing for white people who may feel negative emotions such as guilt or shame when these things are being discussed. However, it is necessary to talk about and understand systemic racism in order to address it, right? So that language, the language of sort of addressing systemic racism, anti-racism, or even if we bring it within the context of gender, language addressing sexism and male privilege, that can evoke negative feelings, right, within some people, but it is necessary. It is necessary in order to be able to address those problems, right? So coming back to why language is important, if we use harmful language, because language is not only reflective, it's also creative, we may be encouraged to think in those harmful terms. If we use harmful language, we may be encouraged to think in those harmful terms. And this is the specific point that this paper is dealing with. It's dealing with the term illegal aliens, right? And viewing how when people were dissuaded from using the term illegal aliens within the American context, as I'm sure you know, and to adopt more positive terminology such as dreamers, right? This had an influence in how people perceived and responded to and behaved towards the particular group in question, whether the group is referred to as legal aliens or dreamers, right? So it says, for example, using the term illegal aliens, which dehumanizes undocumented migrants, has been linked to increased violence against perceived migrants, while use of more positive terms like dreamers results in more positive views of undocumented migrants, right? So why are we considering inclusive language, right? Because we see that language is both reflective and creative, and language reinforces and perpetuates the power differentials that exist within society. So where power differentials specifically related to gender are our primary concern now, language is part of the picture, right? And inclusive language is part of the picture. So I want to talk about
I had a
I want
question.
to talk about another paper. This is a paper called "Can Gender Fair Language Reduce Gender Stereotyping and Discrimination?" And this was published in Frontiers in Science, right? And so what this paper did is that essentially conducted a critical review of what they're calling gender fair language, right? It's zoning in on inclusive language, specifically as it relates to gender. So what they refer to as gender fair language, it's a critical review of how gender fair language contributes to the reduction of gender stereotyping and discrimination. And it also covers strategies for tackling gender bias in languages that have different structures, right? So I'll say a bit about this. All right, so there are essentially three types of language. This is why, part of the reason why inclusive language can be so tricky for us to nail down. Part of it has to do with how different languages are structured differently, right? So there are three types of languages that can be distinguished, right? There are what are called grammatical gender languages, natural gender languages, and genderless languages, right? Grammatical gender languages, natural gender languages, and genderless languages, right? So when we look at German, French, and Czech, right? These are grammatical gender languages. And you know that in French, for example, nouns are gendered, right? Similarly in German and in Czech, these are grammatical gender languages. In these languages, every noun has a grammatical gender, and the gender of personal nouns tends to express the gender of the referent. All right, so those are grammatical gender languages. Then you have natural gender languages such as English or Swedish. And these are languages in which personal nouns tend to be gender neutral. Personal nouns tend to be gender neutral, like neighbor, the word neighbor. And referential gender is expressed pronominally, right? Such as he or she, referential gender, he or she. But the personal nouns tend to be gender neutral, right? So that's English, for example, is that way. Then you have genderless languages, such as Finnish or Turkish, and where neither personal nouns or pronouns signal any gender. So here in genderless languages, gender is only expressed through attributes such as, like say, male, female teacher, right? Or through specific gendered words such as woman or father, right? So what this, you have these languages that are structured differently. And what is suggested is that the approach to making the language more gender fair in the language of this paper, the strategies differ according to the type of language, according to how the language is structured. Right. Okay, but
It's Murray. I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering, you're saying, so I'm just trying to get an understanding. So you're saying in German, for example, for electrician, that they feminize the language by just using the feminine version of it, or do they have to say both all the time? Like I'm not quite sure what you were saying, getting at in that
Okay,
language.
it's like basically including women instead of just saying the male. You say both the male and female.
Okay,
Sort of like saying from a dropout saying ladies and gentlemen, right?
right.
You include both of them.
You include both. Okay.
Yeah. And that's one strategy. And basically they say, usually depending on the structure of the language, it's not a single strategy you're employing. You're employing a number of strategies to make the language more gender fair in the language of this paper, right? And it's recognized that because of the structures of how different languages are structured, approaches may be slightly different. I can only speak for English. I think the point of other languages would have to be addressed by those that speak them, right? But I guess this is a point. This is what is understood. This is what is being understood, accepted. What is done as far as strategies that are being employed to attempt to address, to attempt to make language more gender fair. So I think the main point was not necessarily to go into the strategies, but to make the point that languages are structured differently. This is recognized, but regardless of the language structure and of the ease of implementing gender fair language, a consistent finding is that speakers do not understand masculine forms as referring to both genders equally, but that they interpret them in a male-biased way. So what does that mean? Masculine forms that are used to refer to both genders, such as man for humanity, mankind, such as guys when referring to a group of people, a group of colleagues, or people one may be friendly with, and refer to them as guys. Those are masculine forms that are used to refer to both genders, but it is recognized, I guess, that from the research that in our minds, in terms of how we process those words, we do not process them as neutral. We process them in a male-biased way, right? So that has important implications for us in terms of how we implement, include gender fair language or inclusive language in everyday language, and how we use it consistently. So the fact that words can be interpreted in a male-biased way, I guess we're going to unpack that a bit more as to, further understand why we should care that our minds are processing words regardless of our intentions. Our minds are processing words in certain ways, right? So we will speak to that. So this paper, it covers, the results of three tests that include approximately 3,000 people from Sweden, with I guess the pool of respondents being representative of the broader population. And, it conducts experiments through a survey, right? Surveys that are calculated to measure, I guess, the extent of gender bias that a person may be reflecting, and it lays out some of the context of this research, discussing the fact that many nations across the globe acknowledge that gender inequality persists and that men still predominate in society, and right, a reason for these disparities being the ubiquity of patriarchal attitudes and beliefs, right? So they acknowledge that context, and they acknowledge that various nations, have attempted to mitigate these biases by adopting policies that enshrine gender parity and inclusion, increased access to education for females, and employment, widen childcare availability, attempting to reduce gender pay disparities. That there's a problem that is acknowledged and attempts are being made, right, to address this problem. And in line with these endeavors, rather inclusive language has been adopted by many agencies, right? Opponents of these initiatives argue that, of course, you'll hear opposition to it, I guess, within our current context, right? There are people who oppose this as being, part of the progressive liberal agenda in the culture wars. And they argue that such grammatical innovations hold little sway over people's deeply rooted views about gender and amount to little more than political correctness, right? That's what those who oppose inclusive language would say. So now this paper across these three experiments is establishing the fact that language does influence the salience of males in the minds of people. And we're going to talk about what salience is. Language influences the salience of males in people's minds, and that the reduced salience of males relative to non-males does affect mass opinion toward gender equality in politics, right? So what is salience, right? We're saying that the reduced salience of males in people's minds has a positive effect, a positive influence toward gender equality in politics. And right, so salience, what is it? Salience describes how prominent or emotionally striking something is in someone's mind, right? How prominent or emotionally striking is something in your mind? If something seems to jump out from its environment, it's salient, right? And if you scan an environment and then there's something that pops out at you to call your attention, that thing is salient. If it blends into the background and takes a while to find, it's not salient, right? And salience bias states that the brain prefers to pay attention to salient elements of an experience, right? The brain prefers to pay attention to the salient elements, right, of an experience. So when you are looking at this research, and it shows that sort of the traditional male privileging language increases or entrenches the salience of males, right, in the psyche, right, in the mind, and the recognition that this has knock-on effects, right, for for the visibility of other groups and how those other groups are perceived in the mind, right? It becomes very important, right? So it says that when pondering civic affairs, speakers using masculine pronouns will be more likely to deem it a male realm, viewing other groups as atypical or not typical. And speakers who use masculine pronouns will also be more likely to endorse traditional gender roles as they align with the male-centered view, right? So this paper is, over these 3 studies, is basically communicating the fact that decentering men, decentering men or maleness, even in our language, has a positive influence on how non-male groups are perceived and their salience in our minds, how ready we are to perceive, to see these people, and how positively they are perceived and how capable they are perceived, that decentering men and maleness, even through the language, has a positive effect on all those things. All right, so this essentially brings us back to the main point, which is the importance of gender inclusive language. Right, so it's important to understand that I guess this concept of gender inclusive language, as a movement, right? We have we've brought to the fore, we've discussed it, we've stated its, we've spoken about its importance, right? But again, connecting it to the nature of man and understanding how the brain works, it's important to understand that there is, a solid scientific basis in the push for inclusive language, right? That our language, the language we use, is not only reflective of the world around us, but it influences how we perceive the world around us. It's creative as well as reflective, right? And as people trying to detox from 6,000 years of patriarchy, and understanding the power of language on the mind, we really do need to pay attention, and we really should be more intentional about how we think about and approach this issue of inclusive language. Because if we're going to come to character development, right, remembering that our own language influences our minds, how we perceive, it influences our own character, really. Then it becomes important as people being sealed, right? It's part of the sealing process, at the very least, that we modify our language and our speech to bring it in line with the principles that are present truth. Okay, maybe this is a useful place to pause, and because I have a couple more points to make. But I will open up and ask, do we have any thoughts so far? What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Hey, I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, how would a person perceive, say, for example, descriptive language, identifying like a nationality? Like, say, for example, our neighbors across the street are Filipinos. Would that be offensive in any way, or would that be acceptable?
Well, when we looked at that broad definition of language that causes harm, right? National identifiers, really, like identifying that someone is Canadian or American or Filipino or Zimbabwean, that, you know, those are typically not considered offensive, right? There may be social contexts in which they are loaded, but if I may speak generally, they're typically not considered offensive. So they are descriptive, but you know, not in sort of a way that is offensive. So I don't see that identifying, you know, someone's nationality. Of course, context matters. How is it being used in the context that is being used, right?
Correct.
But typically, no, I don't think that falls under offensive language.
And also just in regards to that, say for example, and again, you know, just I'm just going to use this as an example. Say for example, a person might say, okay, well, most of all the East Indians in Canada are Punjabi. Now, something like that wouldn't be offensive or anything like that either, would it? It was just again descriptive, describing the type of people, or, and I guess again, not putting it into a form where you're trying to put down anybody, but just trying to illustrate a certain point.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
again, in a vacuum, you know, it may be perfectly fine, but context, right? Context matters, right? So the very same words said, you know, in one context, you know, in one context may be fine. The same words said in another context, depending on, you know, what was being discussed or pushed, or, you know, in that conversation, it could be offensive, right? So I don't think, yeah, context matters. I think you just have to be sensitive to that.
Okay, so I just wanted to have a better idea of how, you know, you want to involve inclusive language and correct language in regards to nationality and things like that. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have a thought about being gender neutral. Speaking about my grandchildren, for example, if I'm talking about my granddaughter or my grandson, that's very gender specific. Should I maybe change the way I speak of them, instead of saying more like, instead of saying my granddaughter Audrey did this, I would say my grandchild Audrey, and that would be less genders or more gender neutral. Things like that. Are we thinking about that, or where there's a word that can be used instead of a gender specific? I know that sometimes you can't get around using a gender, but or if it's important to the concept. But what are your thoughts?
I guess as someone who is wrestling with how to approach this and how to do it as well, you know, I don't want to be prescriptive. But I guess I will say that, you know, we are moving away. We're doing what we can to move away from a binary conception of gender and the way we tend to pigeonhole people that way. So it would appear wherever it can be done within the language to reflect that fact, right? That gender is not binary, right? And understanding that our words do react upon us, using spirit of prophecy language, right? There's the, you know, it says, you know, our words react upon us, right? You know, it would appear, I think, wisdom in my mind to attempt to reflect that principle that gender is a spectrum wherever possible, right? Wherever it can be done and still clearly communicate what it is that you wanted to communicate, right? And it means that, and that's the thing, and I guess the papers do, Renata, that's all, that figuring your way around it is, it's iterative, it's awkward, it's right, it's cumbersome, but that's just part of the process of rewiring our brain, right? And the language is part of that. So I don't want to be specific to say what you should or shouldn't do. I just want to say that broad principle that, you know, wherever we can incorporate inclusive language and gender neutral language, and still clearly communicate what we're trying to get across, we should use the extra energy, right, of you know, in brain energy to coach ourselves to start doing that.
Yeah, thinking about that, it just seems it's a huge area that we can work on, because there's so many things that we don't really think about in that terms, like just that simple aspect of changing that one reference. But I imagine that when you start to think about it, or it's on your mind, there are many instances where you can change what you're doing, and it is difficult because, you know, you've been doing it one way for so long. And I know, like, when we used to start praying, we often would say our Father, and it's been now most of us, I don't think, probably do that anymore very often. But when you're first starting, you slip back into your old ways and you're correcting yourself all the time. And so I can really see that there's so many ways that we can change the way we refer to things or think about things in a more general, neutral way, that it is quite pervasive in our language.
Yeah, it is. Sakai, you'd open your mic, and then I think Annabelle. Thanks for that, Mary.
Oh, I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay.
But I was going to say, like, for me, something that I started doing this year is that trying my best to call, and it's mostly to their faces than in their absence. I'm still working on in their absence, but when I'm talking to my nibblings that are males, I call them nibblings and not nephews. And you know, the youngest one, he thinks it's hilarious because every time I'm like, "Oh, you're my nibbling," or I say something in reference to the word nibbling, he's just like, "What is this word?" But I guess I think about, you know, I started doing it to them to kind of give them space to be whoever they want to be, or whoever it is that they really are, and not feel pressured to be one thing or another because society says that their biology dictates one thing or the other. But that's not what I was going to say. I can't remember what I was going to say.
Yeah, but I guess that's a useful thought, you know, because I think it starts with, you know, sort of understanding the sort of, I guess, the importance of language and the psychology of it, you know, in relation to us as being people who believe the midnight cry, who are seeking a particular phase of character development within ourselves, and to promote the same principle within the world. Right. That's like an example of something that's day to day, as to what an effort to sort of try to shift one's language to be inclusive may look like. Thank you for that. Annabelle, you had a thought? Rather, you open your mic. I don't know if you still want to speak.
It's okay. We've talked mainly about gender fair language, but I was just also thinking about ageism and the elderly and children and all that. Like I agree with Murray, it is huge, and we really need to refine our language.
Yes. Go ahead.
People of different nationalities that were living around us, and now I think about the senior citizens here and the elderly, and how they should be addressed, without without attaching elderly person or the aged, or just they are still just people, and it doesn't need to be signified that they're old, or and then I'm thinking of children. How should we, like Sakai touched on that, but how
Annabelle, there?
the
Sounds
term,
like
just so much to think about.
Okay, your phone cut out for a second there, but in any case, yeah, we got the part. It does leave a lot to think about, and how do we go?
Sorry, talking about ageism. Now, Annabelle happened to bring up an interesting point. I mean, automatically when a person says children, we see them as being young or elderly, as that of those that are older. Now, how would a person then change that so that a person wouldn't look at it in that type of a sense?
Yes, because even Ellen White speaks so much to young people, and her messages to young people are just as valid for people of any age.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, reading the Spirit of Prophecy, we sort of have to treat it the same way we treat the Bible, understanding that we're viewing the world through a lens of gender equality, and the Bible was written by patriarchal people to people in a patriarchal world to people with a patriarchal mindset, and and we sort of have to have that factor in terms of how we interpret and relate to those things, how we're supposed to think about them today, right? But I think lots of discussions can be had about how to approach specific situations and words. But for our study, I just want to make a couple more points before we close. All right, so there's the obvious issue of how we refer to each other becomes important, right? And there's the subject that's gotten some treatment in the movement, which is how we refer to God. And I think with how we refer to God, I think we've made progress in terms of no longer referring to God as Father. Right. I think there's still quite a bit of stumbling stumbling around with the pronouns, right? Referring to God as he, you know, when we should figure out a way, if not using they, right? Or just referring to God as God. You know, people have been trying to approach the pronouns in different ways that are gender neutral. But, you know, that one has proved to be a little bit more tricky. But again, how we refer to God is important because, as Elder Tess covered, our mental image of God has our mental image of God has a lot of sort of residual effects, right? And how she saw that a lot of these sort of mental blockages that people had to hearing the things that she was saying about God and about what is needed for this time was because of the apis bull mental imagery that people have about God, and that we need to scrutinize how we perceive God. Because that has, you know, many knock-on effects on you know, how we think, but coming back to how we refer to each other, I just wanted to touch on this point, and it's a point made in the paper, in the article in the American Psychological Association, which is that the issue of impact versus intention. Impact versus intention, right? That when we consider the issue of inclusive language, you know, intention matters on a personal level in your sort of internal self-reflections. Your intention for doing something matters to you. But when we think organizationally or societally, when we take a more sort of macro level look, right? Whether it's the movement level, whether it's the societal level, and prophecy is dealing with societal dynamics more so, right? It's dealing with the world rather than with the individual. We have to consider impact over intention, right? I think of anti-racism. A core concept of anti-racism is the idea that we tend to boil down racism to the idea, to the motivations of the person who said the racist thing or did the racist action, right? We tend to, you know, people say, I'm not racist. I had no malice toward this person, right? I don't, you know, I don't actively hate that group of people. So, you know, in terms of my intentions, I'm not racist. But when we look at a societal level, we see that that's not really how, that's not how racism plays out. It's more complex at the societal level, right? You have racist policies, right? And a policy can be racist based on the impact it has on a group of people, right? If it has a disparate impact on a specific race of people, that policy is racist, right? The framers of the policy may not have had malicious intent toward that group of people. And there've been policies like that where out of the ignorance of the situation, that the ignorance of how a specific group would be impacted by that policy, people enacted racist policies, right? Their intention doesn't even come into it, but we have to consider the impact that it has, right? And it's the same thing like with gender, I don't say gender, inclusive language, not just gender inclusive, but inclusive language more broadly, that I think we have to consider impact how our words impact a given group of people, and how our words reinforce ideas that are harmful to a given group of people. Our intentions, whether we intended to cause harm or not, and so on, aren't the issue there, right? We have to consider impact. Something is sexist if it causes harm along gender lines, regardless of the intention of the person who is saying or doing that sexist thing, right? We're looking at the impact it has on gendered people, right? So I thought that was a very useful point, right? That you know, impact over intention, impact versus intent. Because when you make a mistake, which we will do as we figure things out, you know, right? Think impact over intent. Everyone makes mistakes. We're human. When you learn you've caused someone harm with your words, right, one needs to decenter themselves and not focus on what their intentions were, but the impact that their words had on that group, right? I think of course, you know, with the caveat that we remember the concept of unnecessary harm, that sometimes there are hard things that need to be said, right? That a person may feel negative about, may feel hurt by those words. But those things may still be necessary to be said, right? I think that's the only caveat to that concept of centering impact over intent, right? But as a principle, I think it, you know, we ought to emphasize the impact of our words, particularly when we're thinking about gender, and whether we're using gender inclusive language or not, what impact our words are having. So I hope that makes sense. I'll just share my screen here for a second. To speak a bit about the inclusive language framework. Right, so this is a table from the Inclusive Language Framework published by Berkeley University Center for Gender Equity and Leadership. And it presents some guiding principles and key questions. Of course, these aren't gospel, but they're useful to think about as we think about, you know, as we think about the issue of inclusive language. Key questions. Does this term center dominant groups as the default and or perpetuate harmful stereotypes? If yes, look for a more inclusive term. Does this term have a harmful history or association? If yes, look for a more inclusive term. Does this term contribute to communication in which everyone feels respected and seen? If no, look for a more inclusive term. Does this term convey the intended meaning to all people precisely and effectively? If no, look for a more inclusive term. Is this term the best we can find to communicate the message? If no, look for a more inclusive term, right? So I find these questions useful as we think about, you know, navigating the issue of gender inclusive language and how we apply it in our daily lives. Okay, so I will summarize and then I'll close with a word of prayer. And of course, there'll be some time left at the end for any questions or points that people want to make in discussion. So we've taken a brief look at the importance of inclusive language. We've looked at what it is, what inclusive language is. And we've spoken about how inclusive language is more than just avoiding antiquated or offensive terms. It embraces the fact that power differentials and dynamics in our society are enforced and perpetuated by the language that we use. And of course, power differentials, specifically as they relate to gender, and addressing those power differentials are at the center of the midnight cry. So that's where the connection with inclusive language is, right? We spoke about why language is important, and we spoke a lot about the evidentiary basis for adopting inclusive language, right? That language is both, what did I say? Both reflective, it reflects the world around us, but it's also creative, right? And that it influences how we perceive the world around us. And to use spirit of prophecy terms, our words react upon us, reinforcing, undermining, entrenching various beliefs and ideas in our minds. And right, that becomes very important for us to consider as far as our own character development, and as far as the message that we present, the message of equality that we present. And yeah, I think by way of summary, that is that is everything. I will close with a word of prayer. Let's pray. Lord in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity that we've had to consider this subject of inclusive language, which is important for us that we be more intentional and thorough about this, Lord, because it touches on our character development in response to the midnight cry. Please bless us. We thank you for bringing us to this new year. May you guide us as we go, as we walk from day to day with you. May our feet be firmly planted in the way, in the upward way, in the way to the heavenly Canaan. For we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.